Okay, grade 10. Good to be back. Missed you all. If it was only for 7 days. Obviously, it's a bit weird, sort of being at home again for another week. And I'm sure you're all keen to get back to school and you're getting tired of playing computer games and doing your internet homework on your math and physics and economics. So I feel sorry for you a little bit, but that is the reality of life today. We should feel quite grateful for the Vietnamese government who have done an incredible job of keeping us safe. You only need to look around the world to see that people are dropping like flies. I mean, it's Italy and Spain, and now United States is getting into the scary zones of over 1,000 people per day dropping dead. And to my amazement, Vietnam is probably one of the very few countries in the world that haven't had any deaths at all from this coronavirus. So I think we need to feel grateful both to the government and to the administration of Chu Van An for keeping us safe. I mean, I can only assume they do it because they love us very much and they don't want anything bad to happen to any of us. So they want us to stay home and to learn in different ways. And we need to respond by staying at home and not sort of hanging around in big groups or washing our hands regularly and wearing a surgical scarf if we have to go to the supermarket. But this is very difficult days for everybody. People have lost their jobs, and this is an area of life where nobody who lives on the earth has ever had such an experience. The only similar example of this would be in 1918 with the Spanish flu that had nothing to do with Spain, but people wanted to blame somebody else, so they called it the Spanish flu. And a lot of people died. So we don't want to go back to those days. And I think that our medical services are a lot better equipped and we know what a virus is. I think there was a lot of ignorance back in 1918 when people had no idea as to what was happening. They probably thought it was an act of God or something, that God was angry with us. But today we know a lot about how to control viruses and how we can minimize the pain. It's no longer just for elderly people that you're now getting about a quarter of all the deaths are people from the age of 15 to 40. And so it's now a danger for all of us. So we need to be careful. And so to show to acknowledge really the energy and the help that the government and Chu Van An have been for us, we need to stay at home and to wash our hands and to wear our surgical masks. I'm quite happy. I mean, I'm very happy to be honest with grade 10 homework. I mean, we've got 21 out of 21 students doing their homework. I'd say that 20 out of that 21 is of a very high standard. So that is, unbelievable. It's probably the best results in all of Hanoi. So you have a lot to be proud of. So I'm having a lot more difficulty, to be honest, with the grade 11s than I am with you. You take your studies very seriously, and I appreciate it. And I really, I do love you all for the fact that you're taking this period of study very seriously because this is not a holiday. This is a time where we have to buckle down and try to learn in alternative ways. So last week we had our film on monetary policies, and we had a couple of questions. people ask me questions. So keep these questions coming in. We've had a couple of people on Skype, and we've had about 10 or 12 questions on just on the internet. I mean, from either on Google Classroom or people sending me emails. So we got two questions today. Sometimes we get one, and sometimes we get three, but today we've got two. The first one is, I understand what the multiplier is, but I don't get, that's bad English, by the way, I don't get why it is so important for monetary policy. Okay, so the first step that you have acknowledged is that you understand the idea of the multiplier. Okay, so the multiplier is when the total effect of any new money is less, or I should say more. My goodness, I'm going crazy here. Is much more than the total sum of the original injection of new money. Okay, and I gave you the example last week of your grandmother sending you $100, et cetera, and that you use that money to pay somebody, and they pay somebody else, and they pay somebody else. So the effect on the economy could be a multiple of the original amount. So that $100, the real impact or the real effect of that $100 could be $700 or even more. Okay, I think in Canada it's 7-1. I'm just guessing, but I think that Vietnam would be even higher because people would spend new money even quicker because people are really often desperate for consumption. They need the money quickly to obviously to pay their rent or to buy food or whatever. And so the effect on the economy in a place like Vietnam might be 10 or 11 before it eventually kind of escapes into the bank or into the purchase of imports, I should say. So that's what it all means. Now, the good question, or the question that you're asking, is why is that so important? And that's a good question, because when you get these type of questions, nobody ever just says, what is a multiplier? They expect you to tell us, why is this important, let's say, for the Minister of Finance? Well, the reason is very clear that, to be precise and to have the correct impact on the economy, if there's a shortage of money, you don't want to overwhelm the economy to make things much, much worse than it was before. Okay, so I mean, there's not much point of having government policy if all you do is make things worse. So let's say there's a shortage of money, and you say, oh, okay, well, we need an extra $1 billion. Well, if the impact of you putting in $1 billion ends up being, let's say, $10 billion, and you totally overwhelm the economy with new money, causing inflation, and the inflation goes to 1,000% or whatever, then clearly you've screwed things up. You've made a mess of it, and people will be really, really angry. And so you've got to be careful. I mean, you have the responsibility of government in your hands. And the last thing that people want is, when there's a problem, to make things 10 times worse. So to answer the question, why is it important? Well, it's important because as a means of performing government policy, you don't want to either overcompensate or undercompensate to try to solve a problem. I mean, I'm trying to think of other examples. I mean, if there's a shortage of toilet paper and you suddenly send 100 million rolls of toilet paper onto the market, then clearly you're going to mess the market up, and the producers of toilet paper will not find it worthwhile to produce any toilet paper. So you're actually making things worse. In a much more concrete way, though, governments are asked all the time to solve problems. I mean, it's possible to say that government is being asked too much to solve problems. Like if you don't have a job, it's the government's fault. If the prices are going up, it's the government's fault. And you want government to do something about it. But you don't want them to make things worse. You want to make them better. So for that reason, you need to take the multiplier effect into account whenever you either withdraw money out of the economy, i.e. the Minister of Finance, when the Minister of Finance withdraws money out of the economy or adds money into the economy to try to somehow stabilize the economy. I mean, you can see the Minister of Finance a bit like a car mechanic, and you're trying to adjust, the engine to make it run smoother. I mean, if you feel that it's not running fast enough, you don't want to turn the engine so fast that it actually breaks the engine. In the same way that if the engine is going too fast and you sort of adjust the engine to make it run slower, and by doing it so slowly, you've actually cut the engine so the engine doesn't work anymore. Well, you haven't solved the problem, you've made things worse. So to implement government policy, you need to understand the impact of the multiplier effect on any either injection or withdrawal of money from the economy. So I think that's the answer to your question. The second one is a bit tricky, okay, and it's a bit funny as well. My father tells me that the money supply can be negatively affected by governments borrowing heavily from private banks, causing a shortage of available credit for ordinary customers, which could lead to a recession. Is this true? Well, the answer is yes. And that is actually an important aspect of not macro, but monetary policy and dealing with the money supply is that, when you provide money available to consumers, then consumers are obviously able to borrow money, and that would increase the circulation of money and get the economy going, et cetera, et cetera. So this is a common strategy, particularly by Keynesians who, want to use monetary policy as a means, to get the economy rolling. But if the government, decides that, to solve a lot of their macroeconomic problems, that they need to borrow money themselves. Now, they could be borrowing money from the IMF, as I said to you last week, or they could be borrowing it from a lot of other institutions like the World Bank or private lending institutions like banks within the country itself. And so if the government decides to borrow, let's say, $10 billion from the local banks, from all the banking institutions, and it's almost compulsory as well. I mean, the government's not going to say, please, please, please. They're going to say, we want you to lend us, money so that we can do whatever. I mean, maybe pay off debt or, to stimulate the economy or whatever. But if the government decides to borrow, let's say $10 billion from private banks, maybe, banks only had $10.5 billion to lend to anybody in the first place. And so what you're doing is by the government demanding 10 of those $10.5 billion that was available, you have created an incredible shortage of money for ordinary people like you and I to borrow from. And what this means in reality is that this will mean that the banks will say, sorry, we cannot lend you money to buy a car or to buy a house or to send your children to university or whatever. They just won't do it because they don't have any money to lend. I mean, where do banks get their money from? The banks get their money from taking deposits and then using those deposits of money and lending it out to somebody else. Well, they don't have an unlimited amount of money, do they? They just have enough money from their customers who are depositing their money in their bank, and then they're taking that money, they're giving the customer maybe 5% and then re-lending it to somebody else maybe for 20%. And that's what their profit is the 15%. But if the government decides that they're in some sort of crisis and they say, okay, I want all your money that you have, okay, and of course the government will pay interest, but what it really means is that there is no money available for ordinary people to borrow. And for that reason, you're going to have a monetary crisis on your hand. You're going to have a money supply crisis where, you know, the ordinary people who want to borrow will not have that facility to borrow, and therefore the economy may not take off as it should, or as it might if they had money to borrow. And so we call that the crowding out effect. Okay. You might want to write that in your notes, the crowding out effect. CROWDING, out, OUT, effect, EFFECT. The crowding out effect, okay? And it's an important issue in monetary policy, which is caused by governments being a bit too pushy, you might say, in demanding virtually all the available credit in the country without thinking about the fact that other people need to borrow money too. And by taking all the money, you're creating this incredible shortage, which we call the crowding out effect. Okay, I think that's a bit enough for the questions. So today we're moving on to the handout that we had all about the supply side policies, and you have the handout. You should have received the handout about the main objectives of supply side policies. Usually these are kind of right wing type of policies that you often see. Providing more incentives to work, or making labor more productive. Okay, often when they say that they're trying to increase labor productivity, it might mean that they want young people to go out and get a better education. So education is often seen as an example of improving labor productivity. Um, Increasing occupational and geographical mobility of labor. Okay, a lot of people, including maybe even yourselves, have no intention of moving more than a kilometer away from your mother and father, and that's definitely not a good idea for the economy. They want people to be more mobile. I suppose you could say that I'm super duper mobile because I'm prepared to go wherever the jobs are, and it's taken me almost to every continent in the world other than Australia and the Antarctica, the South Pole. But for a lot of people, in fact, I'd say 95%, and I'm just guessing there, that people are not that mobile. And if you're living in Hanoi and they say, well, there's a really good job waiting for you in Ho Chi Minh City, well, you may say, well, I don't know anybody in Ho Chi Minh City, and I don't want to go there because my mother is here in Hanoi, and I don't want to leave my mother. Da, 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 da. And so somehow by helping or encouraging people to be more mobile, that might actually contribute to reducing the rate of unemployment. Okay? Increasing investment in research and development spending, promoting more competition and stimulating a faster pace of innovation and invention, improving competitiveness, encouraging startups and expansion of new businesses. It's all pretty standard stuff. It's very valid. I mean, there's no doubt about the fact that this is these are the main issues when you're thinking about supply side policies. We've given you a definition here. Supply side policies are government policies that are designed to increase the productive potential of the economy and push the long run aggregate supply curve to the right. Okay, you know what the long run aggregate supply curve is. Okay, it's that one where you've got the Keynesian one where it's got that curve in it, and the monetarist one where it's just basically a vertical line, because that reflects the fact that monetarists believe that any increase in demand will immediately cause more inflation. So, I mean, that would be the technical definition. But certainly in terms of day-to-day ideas, it's really trying to make the economy and government more business friendly usually, and more open to foreign investment, et cetera, et cetera. So most of the economic theory on the subject tends to emphasize creating the conditions for a more business-friendly small government, which will encourage investors and capitalists to develop the economy and to create jobs and to lower inflation. Supply-side policies can be split into two types. Okay, almost every policy, Keynesian, monetarism, or supply side, there's always the Keynesian view and the monetarist view. So market-based supply-side policies, which tend to be more monetarist, okay, are designed to remove barriers to the efficient working of free markets. Okay, so all these examples that they give, things like, removing minimum wages, obviously that is creating more freedom for the businesses to actually pay you less than an absolute minimum, because they would see that that is very unreasonable for governments to enter into the economy and tell businesses how much they should or should not pay their workers. And obviously, businesses are not that interested in increasing wages. And for that reason, they would be against having any form of government minimum wage laws. Or things like subsidies on staple foods like rice. Okay, so a lot of the people who are very market oriented will sort of say, well, subsidies are a nice idea, but you're distorting the market and you're encouraging people to consume a lot of rice, which is means that money has to be spent, a lot of money has to be spent to keep the price of rice low, meaning that when you buy a kilogram of rice, that you're paying part of the price and the government pays the other part to keep the price low. Or the power of trade unions that fight for the benefit of the workers. So obviously, if you're looking for more freedom as a business owner, you don't want trade unions entering into the relationship between the workers and the management and telling management how they should treat their workers. They want to treat the workers the way they want to. And they don't see there's much interest in kind of improving the quality of life or the standard of work or whatever of those workers, and therefore they're not that interested, and therefore they would see trade unions as an inconvenience, which they would just say get rid of them. We don't want spokesmen for the workers. We want you, when we say jump, we want you to say how high. From the business perspective, this might lead to inefficient production, uncompetitively high prices, and increased government debt. Okay, so from the business perspective, anything that pushes the wages above the equilibrium point would be uncompetitively high prices. That basically the main cause, according to monetarists and supply siders, of inflation is that labor is too expensive. And how do you actually reduce the cost of labor? Well, you do it through either eliminating minimum wage or getting rid of the trade unions that are fighting to protect the workers. Supply-side improvements usually originate in the private sector independently of government. However, governments can also attempt to further increase output through supply-side policies. These are government policies designed to increase the rate of economic growth by dealing with market failure. So this is a bit of a Keynesian view of things, where they see this as an opportunity to kind of break into market failures and to try to make them better. Things like monopolies. When governments, by promoting a free market, you suddenly have a tendency to move towards a monopoly, which is a market failure. Well, Keynesians would use supply side policies to essentially break up that monopoly so that different parts of the company will compete amongst themselves, and this will make for lower prices or better service or whatever. They also argue that a market failure being the under providing of public education or healthcare, that sort of thing. A good present day example is the American Health Service being totally incapable of dealing with the coronavirus crisis by relying only on the private sector to solve serious public health dangers. The private sector was originally only looking for where profits could be made during a national pandemic. So in many ways, this is not the role of the private sector to somehow save, the American population from a virus. They're basically looking to make money. And at the moment, Americans are just looking to survive. I mean, they're really, really scared, obviously, just like everybody else is scared. And they see this as a public health danger, while you're asking companies who are just there to make money to go in there and to solve these huge moral and humanitarian questions like, should we allow people to die? Or is it too expensive to save people because, using the available medicines, maybe it's not worth keeping certain people alive? Well, we don't want to live in a society like that. So in some ways, what we're doing, we're asking the wrong people to solve national humanitarian problems like a pandemic. So the debate about market-based policies versus interventionist policies is part of the wider disagreement about the role of the state. Free market economists tend to argue that the state should be as small as possible. Rules and regulations governing the market should be minimal. Taxes should be as low as possible, because of course taxes are supposed to discourage work and enterprise and reduce the productive potential of the economy. Okay, so market-based supply siders would argue that we need to get rid of welfare payments or anything that moves the economy away from the private sector. So certainly the supply siders would be arguing in favor of privatization because they don't see, the point of having, the public sector like in health and education, because they see an opportunity to make a huge amount of money if you actually turned all the schools and hospitals into profit maximizing enterprises. Just imagine how much money that you could make. So monitors believe that a more productive workforce with higher levels of human capital will raise the level of long-run aggregate supply by getting government to implement better education and training. The Keynesians in this argument suggest that left to themselves, free markets will create an inefficient allocation of resources, leading to lower economic growth. Okay, so hence the state needs to intervene to regulate markets and where necessary, provide goods and services directly. Okay, this is what the Keynesians would see the world. Okay, they disagree with removing the minimum wage and controls on trade union power as a strategy to reduce the velocity of the circular flow and to lower aggregate demand. Of course, they Keynesian would feel that way because that's what they argue every day. They always say that the problems that exist in modern society are based on inadequate aggregate demand. So, Keynesians note that monetarists are arguing for better education and training, which sounds good, but only when the government has to pay for that education and not being, and that a lot of these companies don't feel responsible to spend money to train their own workers. Monitors want government to spend money on improving infrastructure such as roads and internet connectivity as long as governments pay for it and not businesses. But that's a bit unreasonable because no one could imagine the private sector being expected to pay for roads or telephone service or internet connectivity. Whatever. That is the role of government. So that's a bit of an unfair criticism by Keynesians. So we got a couple of questions here. I don't see them as being super difficult. Okay, discuss 5 macro benefits of supply side policies. Okay, and explain how each can improve the economy. Okay, so let's take one. Okay, so let's take one example. Okay, what are we gonna? Which one are we gonna choose here? Okay, I mean, if you look at the chart below, there's a whole list of the things like number one on the free market oriented side is privatization. Okay, so obviously, if these people believe that privatization will somehow improve the economy, how will it improve the economy? Okay, so tell me 5 macro benefits of like so give me and explain that. So give me, let's say, the first 5. Okay, privatization, deregulation, income tax cuts, removing regulation, and having flexible labor markets. So those are 5. So give me for each one, tell me how this can improve the economy. How does privatization actually make things better? Okay, tell me how is it that deregulation will make the economy better? How will cutting income tax make the economy better? Okay, you're removing government revenue. Is that going to make the world better? You tell me. Obviously, supply siders believe it because that's what they say. So choose any 5 macro policies, macro supply side policies, and you've got them at the bottom of the list there. And on the chart, and tell me how is this going to make the economy better? Okay, I think that's an easy one. And the second one is, why do Keynesians worry about the creation of a supply side driven, business friendly economy? So why do Keynesians feel uncomfortable about making an economy business friendly? I mean, businesses have to operate. I mean, in most places, businesses operate. Why are Keynesians uncomfortable about the idea of developing policies that will make businesses happy? Private businesses, obviously. Okay, so you tell me. That's a sort of a bit of a philosophical one as well. But tell me why would a business friendly economy be a scary thing for most Keynesians? Okay, so I don't see this as a really difficult one. I think this is one of the easier homework assignments. And I want you to take it seriously, and you do. And I'm really super proud of you. I want to give all of you a hug, but I'm not allowed to because of the coronavirus. So do the homework. I will mark and give a comment. You're all on a bit of a roll, which means you're doing well. And I'm very proud of you. And keep it up and keep safe and wash your hands as often as you can. My skin is right down to the bone now with all the washing that I do. And I always have my surgical mask, just like you should have. And you shouldn't be around groups or, hanging around outside with other people. Just stay at home, do the homework, enjoy life, be brave, think about Ho Chi Minh, and I'm going to see you next week. Bye bye. Bye bye.